Manually selecting faces and unwrapping, or using our Smart UV project method, works great for simple objects like this one. But for more organic or more complex objects, then it's not adequate. I'll hit Tab to go to Object Mode and hit Slash on my number pad to go out of local view. Let's take a look at Suzanne here. I'll hit Slash again to focus on just her. Then I'll hit Tab to go into Edit Mode, and we can see the default UVs laid out here. It would be incredibly tedious to try to select all of these faces one by one and try to unwrap like that. That would just take way too long. And if we try to do Smart UV Project, then we'd end up with a total mess. Because again, it's based on the angles of the faces, and with an organic object that's very round, we're going to end up with mostly garbage. Now, this could technically work. You could still paint on this and it would work fine, but it's very not artist friendly and it's really not optimized. Even if we increase the angle here, like 75, we're going to get our seams in very unfortunate places. And the way that the UVs laid out just don't really make sense. So what we want to do here is unwrap things in a more artist-friendly way. If we were to unwrap this right now, just hit U and unwrap, then we're going to get another giant mess because it's going to try to connect all of our faces here. And as you can see, it doesn't quite work. So like the eyeballs are way out here, these eyeballs are way inside there, and it's just a total mess. So what we want to do is to tell Blender which edges should be split from other edges. And I'll first demonstrate this on our cube object for a second. Let's slash again and look at this one. So let's say we want to unwrap this all at once. Now, if we just select everything with A and hit U and unwrap, then it's not going to work because this is a watertight mesh, or what's called a manifold mesh. There's no holes in it for it to tell where the boundaries should be. So I'm going to go ahead and hit slash again to go into local view and delete these faces on the bottom just so that we can get a non-manifold mesh. I'll delete those faces. Now if I hit A to select everything, U and unwrap, then again it's going to try to unwrap everything in a way that connects it all, with this edge out here being that boundary edge down here. So we want to tell Blender which edges should split in the UV editor. The way that we do that is with marking seams. So let's say we take a couple edges. Let's just take this one right here and this one right there. And let's take the edges along the top, along this curve as well. And this is just kind of enclosing this shape of this curve here on the front. So we're going to take all the edges that surround that shape and then go to UV and mark seam. You can think of seams just like seams on a shirt. It's where the flat cloth needs to be cut in order to create the proper 3D shape when it's connected to the other pieces. We're doing that same thing here, but backwards, starting with the 3D shape and making cuts so that it can lay out flat in the UV editor. Once those are marked as seams, we can select everything with A, hit U, and unwrap again. And now this section is going to be separate from the others. It's going to be nice and neatly laid out, while the rest of this is still going to be quite a giant mess. So what we want to do is place seams everywhere where the edges should be split. And we want to do that to minimize stretching. So in this case, I'll hit 2 to go into edge select mode again. And maybe I want to separate out this section up here. So I'll select these edges that run along here. There's not really any problem with these edges being connected because it's going to unfold into a flat straight line. So I'll right click and mark seam. You can find that command either in the UV and mark seam, or if you're in edge select mode, you can just right click and mark seam right here. Just be aware that if you're in face select mode or vertex select mode, that won't be available in your right click context menu. But if you're in edge select mode, it will. So now we can select everything again with A, hit U and unwrap. And now this section, we can go to our island select mode, select it, and this one is nice and neatly laid out. But of course, everything else is not. So let's continue adding our seams here. Maybe we can go up here and down this side, up this side, right click and mark seam, U and unwrap. So now those sides are nice and neatly laid out. Maybe you want to separate up this top section, right click and mark seam, select everything, U and unwrap. And now we're getting closer, but we're still getting a lot of stretching on these boxes. We have the extrusion up here and the extrusion down here on the inset, and those are extremely stretched because, again, it's trying to connect everything in a way that's just really not possible. So we can separate this out as well. What I'll do is I'll just surround this box with a seam such that the area around it is just going to be kind of like a window frame shape. So I'll mark seam. And you can see that surrounding area up here, but we still have this box to deal with. Now what we could do is just mark all of these as a seam and just unwrap it as if it were a cube, and each of these sides would be its own face. But instead of that, what we can do is unfold it like a box. So we can think about it very much similarly to a cardboard box. And if we cut it right along this line here, then these faces can unfold outwards. So again, here's what this looks like in the UV editor, like so. But if we just mark seams along these edges, right click and mark seam, select everything, U, and unwrap, then you can see it unfolded very much similarly to a box. If we can help it, it's good not to have our UVs be diagonal because otherwise they don't line up with the pixels on the image. So I could rotate it like that, but I do know that every time we unwrap this, it's going to rotate that into place, so I'm not going to worry about it for now. But we can do a similar thing down here. I'll hit 2 to go to edge select mode and just mark a seam around this area here so that this will be a nice flat unwrap. Right click and mark seam. So this area down here looks great, but this area up here still has some stretching. So what I'll do is I'll take these corners again, unfold it like a box, right click and mark seam to slice that area, U, and unwrap, and there we go. So now we're getting those nice straight lines and everything is working great. So again, we don't want this rotation happening in the UV editor. That's something we'll talk about a little bit more when it comes to best practices for texture painting and unwrapping. But for now, I'll just rotate this back into place and maybe scale it down a little bit. Okay, so that is the basics of unwrapping with seams, and as you can see, it gives us a really good result, and it's incredibly flexible. We can be as precise as we need to. Where this really comes into handy, though, is with more complex objects. So let's hit Tab to go into object mode, / to exit local view, and go back to looking at this monkey. I'll hit / again, and hit Tab to enter edit mode. I'm also going to go to the modifier properties and uncheck the edit mode icon here so that we're not looking at it in edit mode, because I don't really want to see that on top because it gets a little bit confusing here. So you could do that, or you could just disable it completely if you'd like. But now I can see it in object mode, but not in edit mode. All right, so here we have our UVs nice and neatly laid out because this is a default object and it came unwrapped for us, but there aren't any seams. So while we have the islands here, if we do anything like U and unwrap, then we're going to get this nasty result. So what we could do to see what seams there are already, or how it was unwrapped in the first place, we could select everything in the UV editor by hitting A, and then going to UV and seams from islands. And it's going to create seams along all of these edges on the exterior of the islands. Now if I hit Alt-A to deselect, we'll see that red line, which indicates a seam running along our object. And we can see this even better if we go to wireframe view by holding Z. But let's try to do this for ourselves. I'll select everything, hit U, and clear seam. Now if we try to unwrap this again, this will go back to our gross default result. It's unwrapped the eyeballs nicely, but that's about it. So now let's go ahead and try to place those seams ourselves manually. And we don't have to follow exactly the way it was before. But we do know that we want the face to be a little bit separate from the rest of the head. So let's go ahead and just outline the face with seams. I'll select these edges here, going up and above the brows. Right click and mark seam. So I can just select those edges, right click and mark seam. Now this can be incredibly tedious and we're not going to see our result right away. In order to be able to actually see it, we have to select everything with A, hit U and unwrap, and that can be pretty tedious. So what I'm going to do is enable an option that's going to allow it to do all of this stuff for us. It's going to unwrap and pack the islands automatically as we go. So in order to actually see that though, we need to turn on selection sync, which again is an option that I generally advise keeping off. But when it comes to what we're going to do here and just unwrapping our objects like this, then it is a great option to turn on, because what it allows us to do is to go to our UV option and click Live Unwrap. Hey, quick update for future versions of Blender. If for whatever reason you can't find the Live Unwrap option under the UV menu in the 3D view, then you're going to have to look up and to the right under the Options popover, and there you'll find it. If you don't see the tool header, you can either enable it by right-clicking, going to Header and Show Tool Settings, or you can always find the same options over in the Tool tab of the Properties editor. Now in the UV editor, you can still find it under the UV menu, but at some point in the future, they might create an Options menu for the UV editor to make it consistent with the 3D view. So if you can't find it over here, then that's another place to check. Wherever you find it though, it's still going to work exactly the same. You can find the Live Unwrap option in both the 3D view and the UV editor, and you have to enable it in whichever editor you're going to be marking seams in. When that's on and Selection Sync is on, then we just need to mark a seam. And it'll unwrap and pack our islands for us, which is incredibly helpful, so we can see our result in real time. Let's do that over here as well. Let's take these edges, right-click and mark seam, and there we go. Now, some of you may say that even this is a little bit too slow, selecting edges and marking seams. Well, there is actually a way to speed this up even faster. What we can do is use the hotkey Control, and what that will do is select the shortest path between two components. So if we select an edge down here and select an edge down here, it'll select the entire path in between. Now you see it jumped and unwrapped, and that's because I was playing with this earlier and I chose the Edge Tag option, Tag Seam. By default, it's set to Select. So you can just select one edge, hold Control, select another edge, and it'll select the entire path, the shortest path from one to the other. But you can also set the edge tag to mark seam. So if I select these edges and set that to tag seam, then anytime I use that Control hotkey, it's going to add a seam for me. So I can select this edge and then that one, it'll add a seam. So I can just continue holding Control and selecting edges, and as long as I'm selecting ones that are connected to each other, then it's just going to work. Now sometimes the shortest path isn't necessarily the one you want, so you might have to go back. Let's say if I selected that edge and one way down here, it's not going to go in the direction that I wanted it to. It's going to pick a different path because I want it to go all the way around the back of the head, but that wasn't the shortest path. So you might have to do it in slightly larger increments, but you can still choose that one, hold Control, select this edge, and then hold Control, select that one, and in just a couple clicks, we're done. So that was incredibly fast. Now you might want to do this, but with the ears instead. So let's go ahead and unwrap the ears by just creating a circle around them to kind of cut them out because they're more of a complex shape. I'm just holding Control and selecting these edges here. So cut that ear out. Let's do the same for this one over here. Let's see, it looks like I went around this way, kind of around the outside. Oh, I don't want that one. Let's choose that edge, and there we go. Okay, so we have our ears here, but there's still a little bit of stretching. You can see in the UV editor, that's pretty obvious. And if we hit tab to go into object mode, then it becomes very clear that there's a lot of stretching going on here. So what we need to do is just add more seams to kind of slice this open. And I guess that's kind of a gruesome word to use when it comes to talking about faces and ears, and it's kind of weird. But what we want to do is just treat this as if it was a piece of cloth and cut it so that it creates two separate sections that we can lay out nice and flat. So what I'm going to do is just select this path up here, go around the ear like that. And as you can see, as we create those seams, it unwraps nicer and nicer. So I'll separate the front part of the ear from the back completely, which is a little bit different than what was the default. So you can see we have a nice unwrap there on the back and a nice one there on the front as well. So it still has a little bit of stretching, but it's not too bad. You have to kind of keep a balance between the number of islands to manage versus the amount of stretching and all of that stuff. But once we have a nice unwrap like this, that's very human readable, we can look at this and see which part of the face is what, then we can call it a day. Though maybe I don't necessarily like how we have a seam running straight along the back there. Maybe I'd rather have the seam running along the other direction, and that's okay too. So what I'll do is select this vertex or that edge, and then hold Control, select that one, and that's going to remove a seam. Do the same thing down here. So now we have all of that stretching back here, but now I can just take this part and hold Control, create a seam there. And it looks like it didn't remove our seams on that part of the head. So I'm just going to select them, right click and clear seam to undo that. And that works well. And now we just need to select a seam here to split the top part of the head from the bottom part. So I'll select that on both sides, right click and mark seam. And now we've split the top half of the head from the bottom half of the head. Now there's pretty much an infinite amount of variations that you could do here. There's no perfect answer here. No matter what you do, there's always going to be some stretching or too many islands or somewhere in between those two extremes. But once you have something that is reasonably unwrapped, it looks like it's nice and evenly laid out across the entire surface, and it's something that could be easily painted on, then I'm pretty happy to call it a day. Though there is a little bit too much stretching here on the bottom. So what I'm going to do is create a couple more seams just to split this area a little bit more and try to get rid of that stretching. Right click and mark seam. And that works a lot better. Okay, so we've gotten rid of some of that stretching, and you generally try to keep seams away from very visible areas, which is why I'm not creating a seam, right down the middle of the face or straight across the eyes or anything like that, because that can cause some glitches. You might see some texturing issues along these seams, and so we try to hide them wherever possible. So I'm trying to place them in pretty discrete areas where it's not going to be super obvious. You'll be able to hide them fairly well, but it's not always going to be perfect. So just try to place them in areas where it's a little bit more discrete, and then we should be good to go. So I definitely recommend trying this out for yourself. Add a Suzanne and maybe reset the UVs or do something else to get rid of the default unwrap and try unwrapping for yourself. Once you're happy with your result, then let's move on to the next video.